Hey there, and welcome back to English as a Second Language. I'm David, and I'm really happy you're here with me today. You know, there's something special about sitting down with a cup of coffee and just having a good conversation about life, isn't there? That's exactly what we're going to do today. If you're new to our channel, welcome. And if you've been following along with our IELTS series, you know we've been working through some of the most common topics that come up in the IELTS speaking test. Today, we're diving into one that's really close to my heart, describing a time you helped someone. This is actually one of the most frequently asked cue card topics in IELTS Speaking Part 2. And I think you'll find it's also one of the most rewarding to talk about. Now, before we get started, I want to let you know that we'll be reviewing some really useful vocabulary at the end of today's episode. So stick around for that. It's going to help you sound more natural and confident when you're telling your own stories about helping others. You know, I was thinking about this topic yesterday while I was walking my dog in the park. I saw this elderly gentleman struggling with his groceries. Bag had torn and apples were rolling all over the sidewalk. Without even thinking about it, I bent down to help him collect everything. It was such a small thing, really, but the smile on his face was absolutely priceless. And that got me thinking, we all have these moments in our lives where we've helped someone, don't we? The beautiful thing about helping others is that it doesn't always have to be something huge or dramatic. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can make the biggest difference in someone's day. And when you're preparing for IELTS, having a good story about helping someone is incredibly valuable because it shows examiners that you can talk about personal experiences with emotion and detail. So today, I want to share a story with you about a time I helped someone, and then we'll talk about how you can structure your own stories for the IELTS test. We'll also explore some of the vocabulary and phrases that will help you tell these stories in a natural, engaging way. Let me take you back about 5 years ago. I was living in a small apartment in the city, and I had this neighbor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Chen. She was probably in her 70s, and she lived alone in the apartment next to mine. Now, Mrs. Chen was one of those people who always tried to do everything herself. She had this incredible sense of independence, and I really admired that about her. But here's the thing, Mrs. Chen didn't speak much English. She had moved to the country to be closer to her daughter, but her daughter worked long hours and couldn't always be there to help with day-to-day things. I could see that sometimes Mrs. Chen felt quite isolated, especially when she needed to deal with official paperwork or talk to service providers on the phone. One evening, I was coming home from work when I heard this frustrated crying coming from the hallway. I looked around and saw Mrs. Chen sitting on the floor outside her apartment, surrounded by papers and looking absolutely overwhelmed. She had her phone in her hand and she was clearly upset about something. I approached her gently and asked if she was okay. Through a mixture of broken English and some gestures, I managed to understand what was happening. She had received a notice from the electricity company saying that her power was going to be cut off because of an unpaid bill. The problem was she had actually paid the bill, but there had been some kind of mix-up with the payment system. She had been trying to call the company to resolve the issue, but the language barrier was making it impossible for her to explain the situation. This is what we call a challenging situation, when circumstances make something difficult to deal with. Mrs. Chen was facing a language barrier, which means the difficulty of communicating because of different languages. And she was feeling overwhelmed, which means she felt like the problem was too big for her to handle alone. I sat down on the floor next to her and said, "Mrs. Chen, let me help you with this." I could see the relief in her eyes immediately. We went into her apartment and she showed me all the paperwork, the original bill, the payment receipt, and the notice from the company. Everything was in order on her end, so I knew we could sort this out. I called the electricity company and explained the situation. Of course, I had to wait on hold for about 20 minutes. You know how these customer service calls can be, but Eventually, I spoke to a representative who was very helpful. I explained that there had been an error in their system, and I provided all the payment details. The representative checked everything and confirmed that Mrs. Chen had indeed paid her bill on time. They apologized for the confusion and assured me that the disconnection notice would be canceled immediately. When I hung up the phone and told Mrs. Chen that everything was resolved, she started crying again, but this time they were tears of relief and gratitude. She kept saying, thank you, and squeezing my hand. It was such a touching moment, and I realized that what had taken me about an hour to resolve could have been an incredibly stressful and potentially serious problem for her. But the story doesn't end there. Over the following weeks, Mrs. Chen and I developed a wonderful friendship. She would often knock on my door with a plate of homemade dumplings or invite me for tea. She started teaching me some basic Mandarin phrases, and I would help her with English pronunciation. We had this beautiful cultural exchange happening right there in our apartment building. Mrs. Chen also introduced me to her daughter, and I learned so much about their family's journey to this country. Her daughter was working as a nurse and studying to get her qualifications recognized here. It was inspiring to see how hard they were both working to build a new life in a new country. What I learned from this experience is that helping someone often creates a connection that goes far beyond the original problem. When we offer assistance to others, we're not just solving their immediate issue, we're building bridges between people, creating understanding, and often forming lasting relationships. From an IELTS perspective, this story demonstrates several important elements that examiners look for. First, it has a clear beginning, middle, and end, what we call a narrative structure. I set the scene by describing Mrs. Chen and our living situation. Then, I explained the problem that arose, described how I helped resolve it, and finally talked about the positive outcome and what I learned from the experience. The story also includes specific details that make it interesting and believable. I mentioned the torn grocery bag, the 20-minute wait on hold, the homemade dumplings. These little details bring the story to life and show that I'm not just making something up on the spot. Another important aspect is the emotional element. I talked about Mrs. Chen's frustration, her relief, her gratitude, and my own feelings throughout the experience. This emotional depth is exactly what IELTS examiners want to hear because it shows that you can express feelings and reflect on experiences in English. Now, let me share another perspective on helping others. Sometimes the help we provide isn't about solving a crisis. It's about offering support during challenging times. I want to tell you about my friend Jake, who went through a difficult period a few years ago. Jake had been working at the same company for about 8 years when he suddenly lost his job due to company downsizing. This meant the company had to reduce the number of employees to cut costs. Jake was devastated. He had a mortgage to pay, a young family to support, and suddenly he found himself unemployed for the first time in his adult life. When Jake first told me about losing his job, I could see he was not only worried about the financial implications, but also struggling with his self-confidence. He kept saying things like, maybe I'm not good enough, or I should have seen this coming. It was heartbreaking to watch someone I cared about doubt themselves so much. I realized that Jake needed more than just sympathy. He needed practical support and encouragement. So I offered to help him with his job search. We spent several evenings working on his resume, practicing interview questions, and researching potential employers. I also connected him with some people in my professional network who might be able to offer advice or job leads. This kind of help requires what we call patience and persistence. Patience means being able to wait calmly and not getting frustrated when things take time. Persistence means continuing to work toward a goal even when it's difficult. Job searching can be a long process, and Jake needed someone to remind him not to give up. During this time, I also tried to provide emotional support. We would go for walks together, and I would listen to his concerns and fears. Sometimes he just needed someone to vent to. That means to express his frustrations and worries openly. Other times, he needed encouragement and reminders of his strengths and accomplishments. After about 3 months of searching, Jake found a new job that was actually better than his previous position. It offered more opportunities for growth, better work-life balance, and even a higher salary. When he called to tell me the good news, he said something that really stuck with me. "I couldn't have done this without your support. You helped me believe in myself again." This experience taught me that helping someone doesn't always mean solving their problems for them. Sometimes the most valuable help we can offer is simply being present, listening, and providing encouragement when someone is facing challenges. We call this emotional support, helping someone feel better and more confident through difficult times. Both of these stories illustrate different types of helping. With Mrs. Chen, I provided practical assistance. I used my language skills to resolve a specific problem. With Jake, I offered ongoing support during a difficult transition period. Both types of help were meaningful, but they required different approaches and different kinds of involvement. When you're preparing your own story for IELTS, think about the different ways you might have helped someone. Maybe you helped a classmate understand a difficult concept, or you assisted an elderly neighbor with their shopping, or you supported a friend through a breakup. The key is to choose a story that you can tell with genuine emotion and specific details. Let me give you some practical advice for structuring your IELTS response. When you get a cue card that asks you to describe a time you helped someone, you'll typically have 1 minute to prepare and then 2 minutes to speak. Here's a simple structure you can follow. Start by setting the scene. Explain who you helped, when and where this happened, and what the situation was. Then describe the problem or challenge the person was facing. Next, explain exactly what you did to help and how you went about it. Finally, talk about the outcome, what happened as a result of your help, and reflect on how the experience made you feel or what you learned from it. Remember to use connecting words and phrases to make your story flow smoothly. Words like first, then, after that, finally, and as a result, help the examiner follow your narrative easily. Also, don't forget to include your personal feelings and reflections. This shows that you can express emotions and think critically about your experiences. Another important tip is to be specific. Instead of saying, "I helped someone with their problem," say, "I helped my elderly neighbor resolve a billing dispute with the electricity company." Specific details make your story more interesting and more believable. It's also perfectly fine to talk about small acts of kindness. You don't need to describe how you saved someone's life or donated thousands of dollars to charity. Sometimes the most meaningful help is simply listening to someone who needs to talk, helping carry heavy groceries, or explaining something that seems confusing. Let me share one more quick story to illustrate this point. Last year, I was at the grocery store when I noticed a young mother struggling with her shopping cart, her crying baby, and her toddler who was trying to run away. She looked absolutely exhausted and stressed. I approached her and offered to help load her groceries into her car while she dealt with the children. It took maybe 5 minutes of my time, but the gratitude in her eyes was incredible. She said, "Thank you so much. I was about to have a complete meltdown." Sometimes that's all it takes, just a few minutes of kindness to make someone's day significantly better. This brings me to an important point about the vocabulary we use when describing helping others. The words we choose can really impact how our stories come across. For example, instead of just saying, "I helped," you might say, "I assisted, I supported, I lent a hand, or I came to their aid." Each of these phrases has a slightly different feeling and can make your story more engaging. When describing the person you helped, you might use words like struggling, overwhelmed, in need of assistance, or facing a challenge. These words help paint a picture of why your help was needed and appreciated. To describe the help you provided, you could use phrases like, I offered my assistance, I stepped in to help, I provided support, or I went out of my way to help. The phrase went out of my way is particularly good because it shows that you made a special effort to help someone. When talking about the outcome, you might say the person was grateful, relieved, appreciative, or touched by your kindness. You could also mention that your help made a difference, solved the problem, or provided peace of mind. Throughout your story, try to include some descriptive language that helps the examiner visualize what happened. Instead of saying, Mrs. Chen was sad, I said, she was sitting on the floor, surrounded by papers, looking absolutely overwhelmed. This kind of descriptive detail makes your story come alive. Now, I want to address something important about cultural differences in helping others. In different cultures, people have different expectations about when and how to offer help. In some cultures, it's common to immediately offer assistance when you see someone struggling. In others, people prefer to ask for help rather than have it offered unsolicited. When you're telling your story, it's worth mentioning how you approach the situation respectfully. For example, I said I approached Mrs. Chen gently and asked if she was okay before jumping in to help. This shows cultural sensitivity and awareness of appropriate boundaries. This cultural awareness is something that IELTS examiners appreciate because it demonstrates sophisticated thinking about social interactions. It shows that you understand that helping others isn't just about the action itself, but also about how you approach people and respect their dignity. Speaking of respect and dignity, it's important to remember that when we help others, we should do so in a way that empowers them rather than making them feel helpless or dependent. Good help teaches people skills they can use in the future, connects them with resources, or simply provides temporary support during difficult times. For example, when I helped Mrs. Chen with the phone call, I also showed her how to organize her bills and payment receipts so she could handle similar situations more easily in the future. When I helped Jake with his job search, I taught him interview techniques and networking strategies that he could continue to use throughout his career. This approach to helping others shows maturity and wisdom, which are qualities that IELTS examiners value in candidates who are aiming for higher band scores. As we start to wrap up today's episode, I want to ask you a few questions to help you think about your own experiences with helping others. Take a moment to consider these and maybe even practice answering them out loud. First, can you think of a time when you helped someone solve a specific problem? What was the situation and how did you assist them? Try to remember the details. Where were you? What exactly did you do? And how did the person react? Second, have you ever provided emotional support to someone going through a difficult time? How did you help them feel better? And what was the outcome of your support? Third, what's the most meaningful act of kindness you've ever done for someone else? It doesn't have to be something big. Sometimes the smallest gestures have the biggest impact. Fourth, how do you usually approach someone who seems to need help? Do you ask if they need assistance or do you wait for them to ask you? And finally, what did you learn about yourself from the experience of helping someone else? Did it change your perspective on anything or did it teach you something new about human nature? These questions are similar to the follow-up questions you might get in IELTS Speaking Part 3. So thinking about them now will help you prepare for the more abstract discussion part of the test. Before we finish, let me share one final thought about the importance of helping others. In our increasingly connected but sometimes impersonal world, acts of kindness and assistance create genuine human connections. When we help others, we're not just solving problems, we're building community, fostering understanding, and creating a more compassionate society. From a language learning perspective, stories about helping others are particularly valuable because they allow you to demonstrate a range of vocabulary, express emotions, and show cultural awareness. They're also stories that most people can relate to, which makes them engaging for your audience, whether that's an IELTS examiner or just friends you're having a conversation with. Remember, when you're preparing for IELTS or just working on your English conversation skills, the goal isn't to have the most dramatic or impressive story. The goal is to tell your story clearly with good structure, appropriate vocabulary, and genuine emotion. Authenticity is much more valuable than trying to create something that sounds impressive but isn't really true to your experience. I hope today's episode has given you some ideas for your own stories about helping others, and I hope it's inspired you to think about the meaningful connections we can create through acts of kindness. Remember, we all have the power to make a positive difference in someone's life, whether it's through solving a practical problem, offering emotional support, or simply being present when someone needs us. As always, thank you so much for joining me today on English as a Second Language. I really appreciate you taking the time to listen and learn with me. If you found this episode helpful, please remember to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you don't miss any of our IELTS series episodes. Next week, we're going to explore another common IELTS topic. Describe a place you would like to visit. I'm excited to share some travel stories with you and help you build the vocabulary you need to talk about your dream destinations. Till then, keep practicing your English, keep looking for opportunities to help others, and remember that every conversation is a chance to improve your skills and connect with people around you. Take care, and I'll see you next time.